In this tutorial, you'll learn how to forward calls received on your virtual phone number onto another person. With a minimal configuration and one webhook on a Koa server, you can pass inbound calls to any number you choose. Before getting started, you'll need some knowledge of JavaScript, Node.js installed on your machine, and a Vonage API account for your API credentials. Begin by creating a project folder on your local machine. Then run npm init to set up a new Node.js project. To start, you'll need to do some setup of your application and Ngrok, or another way to host your endpoints. You can use Ngrok to expose an endpoint on your local machine rather than pushing your code to a publicly accessible server for ease of development. Download it from ngrok.io and follow the setup instructions. In a new terminal window, start Ngrok on port 3000. Keep that terminal window open so you can copy the Ngrok URLs you've been assigned later in the tutorial. Next, you'll need to install the Nexmo CLI from npm. Unless you'll be using a different developer account for each project you create, you can set up the CLI by providing the credentials from your Vonage dashboard globally. Because you'll be storing some variables in a env file, it's also a good time to remember to install .env. Let's create the env file now with a small template for the variables the application will need. Create a new application using the Nexmo CLI, supplying a name that will distinguish it in your dashboard, and the Ngrok endpoints you'll code in the next section. This is where you need to swap in your own Ngrok HTTPS URL. As long as this command is successful, you'll receive an application ID, which you can paste into your env file for safekeeping. Now you're ready to create your server. You'll need to install Koa.js and two middleware packages, Koa Body and Koa Router. Your server will import .env to give you access to the variables in env, as well as Koa and its middleware. It will create a new Koa application, wire up the middleware, then finally listen on port 3000, which is the port we supplied to Ngrok. Your server has two routes, one which will answer inbound calls and one which will log events. The second is simpler, so let's flesh that out first. The handler will do two things: log the contents of the request to the console and return an HTTP 204 status. You also need to provide a handler for the answer endpoint. If you've worked with Vonage APIs before, this may look familiar. We want to create a Nexmo call control object, NCCO, and return that as a JSON object. There are several properties we need on this object. Firstly, the action, which is connect. That is, we want to connect our caller to another endpoint. Then, an array of event URLs, the only member of which will be our logging endpoint. Also, the from number, which is not the inbound caller's number, but a virtual phone number through which we will proxy. And lastly, an endpoint definition whose type is phone, and whose number is the number we want to forward the call to. The code itself is minimal. Notice we're using process.env to get the variables in your env file, so you can keep phone numbers you may not want shared private. You don't have to provide a URL for event URL unless you want to use a different event handler for this NCCO than for the application as a whole. Your server is almost ready to go, but you'll need to supply phone number values in env in order to test it. You can rent a number within your Vonage dashboard or use the command line, like so. Don't forget to customize the country code based on your location. I'm Canadian, so I have CA listed at the end. You'll get a list of available numbers, all in E164 format, which you'll always use when interacting with the Vonage API. Once you find a number you like, you can rent it via the CLI. After confirming the number is rented, you can add it to your env file along with your own number or another number you'd like to forward the calls to. You also want to associate the number you've rented with your application, which is done from the command line. You supply 2 arguments, the new number and your application ID. And with that, you're all set. Make sure Ngrok is still running, and if it's not, you'll need to restart it and update the endpoint URLs in your app, and then start your server with Node index.js. Now, if someone calls your virtual number, it should ring your phone. If you want to take your application further, as a next step, you can use the information in the events endpoint to see if calls have been answered and do things like play a message or try forwarding to a backup number. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below. Until next time, thanks for watching!